So, left off just saying about government intervention in the 2008 crash. It might well be followed by more government intervention in 2020, throughout 2020, and perhaps even beyond that. We might see a huge uptick in government expenditure, and within that, of course, the central bank, playing a key role in all of this. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about the bank. We referred to it several times in the audio classroom, in the virtual classroom, but I wanted to just ram home this point about the independence of the bank. That this was a central feature of this idea of fiscal and monetary stability in the 80s and 90s, that you should take away from politicians the power of making what were fairly expert and technical questions regarding monetary policy, regarding the money supply, how that policy should be calibrated alongside fiscal policy. Now, for that reason, the central bank, the Bank of Canada, is often termed as somewhat independent from government. Now, if we were looking at this in terms of gradations, well, I think it's fair to say there are gradations of independence. It's not the case that you're either independent or you're dependent. There's a significant amount of autonomy, perhaps decision-making power, which maybe just falls short of being completely independent. I think that's probably true of the Bank of Canada. The senior officers of the bank are appointed by politicians. Cabinet needs to approve the appointments, just as they do in most other jurisdictions. But the day-to-day operations and the decision making of those officials is meant to be free of political interference. Whether it is completely or not is another matter. I suspect it's not entirely free of political influences, for the very good reason that monetary and fiscal policy kind of have to work in tandem, and fiscal policy being the province of government rather than the bank, there has to be a certain degree of collaboration between the different institutions. But in terms of how the bank's organised and how the decision-making process takes place, in terms of the fairly long tenure which the officials enjoy, the governor, for example, is employed for 7 years. So that guarantees security of tenure, if you like. It means that they're not going to be in the job for a very short time. And there's two advantages to this, I think. Firstly, it means that they're not going to be susceptible to making short-term decisions for popularity or for short-term political ends, for example. And secondly, it allows for long-term planning as well. So it allows them to take the sort of longer view, if you like, rather than having to make an impact in their first year or two to show results. It allows them to perhaps have a longer term perspective. Both of these things, I think, can make for better decision making when you're free of political influences. We're getting away then from that scenario of economic or business decisions being made on the basis of politics, which is always a bad idea, but there's still a lot of it around in government, unfortunately, especially surrounding fiscal policy. But in terms of monetary policy, we've diluted that influence by giving the bank officials a certain amount of independence and allowing them great expertise to be the main influence, if you like, in decision making. So this is kind of ruled by experts in the same way, perhaps, as the bureaucracy in the government apparatus is relying on expert opinion, impartial, knowledgeable people making decisions. The idea being, of course, that it's going to make for better decision making, more robust decisions, fewer decisions made on the basis of things like politics or short-term popularity, for example. So that's the bank. and you can see the advantages of the actual administrative organisation, the appointment procedure, the decision-making process is theoretically better on account of that. Now, that's not true for fiscal policy. The fiscal policy just means the spending priorities of the government, what it hopes to do, how it proposes to spend money in the economy, what areas it wants to give particular emphasis to. Of course, every government comes in with a specific agenda. Some may want to spend more on things like welfare, social policy, put more funds into education and healthcare. Generally, that would be, if you want to divide parties up, that would probably be those on the left who would be looking to fund these kind of parts of the economy, and of course that may mean higher taxes. Those on the right, generally the Conservatives would by and large focus more on tax cuts, trying to incentivize higher earners, trying to create employment, believing in a regime which was to encourage entrepreneurship. So every government's going to have different priorities. And of course, fiscal policy, if we look at the policies of governments of the past, we can see how this has played out, of course, at federal and provincial level. We'll come on to Ontario next week when we look at the Ontario's deficit and how that's been adversely affected by poor decision making and perhaps a misreading of priorities by successive governments, most of them being liberal. But fiscal policy obviously important to maintain a balance between different parts of the society, ensure that you maximise the prospects for economic growth, whilst providing the social safety net, of course, for those who are less fortunate. So always a balance to be struck there between the two things. Now, if government does get into debt, of course, and often, of course, it's a fact of life for most governments that they do. Balanced budgets are great in theory, but they're fairly rare these days. Although, as I've said, between the 90s and 2008, we did have budget surpluses in the federal government. So, of course, there's always sometimes resort to borrowing on the capital markets, selling debts through bond issues. That's secured and unsecured. And of course, even issuing money through, whether that's through quantitative easing, as we looked at a couple of days ago, or through resort to the printing press. Now, of course, that carries the threat of inflation, and this is, of course, something which goes against the stated monetary policy now of the central bank and most Canadian governments. We all tend to subscribe to this idea of inflation targeting, now keeping inflation down to a benchmark level. That can be undone by too expansive fiscal policy, too free spending. So you can see where the links between monetary and fiscal policy are, that the bank, in its attempts to try and control inflation, has an indirect effect, or you might say quite a direct effect on fiscal policy. If the government is following and being consistent in its application of fiscal policy in the same way it is with monetary policy, it's not going to overspend. It's going to try and keep within as close as possible to its budget. Of course, inflation very damaging, not just for governments but for individuals as well. So this emphasis on inflation in recent years does have a very real impact on not just monetary policy and policy of the bank, but also on the government, how it spends its money. All governments seem to come to power now pledged to maintain fiscal responsibility, show that they're fiscally conservative, that the money they spend will be necessary expenditure, and either in terms of it's providing a vital social function, so it has a public interest function, or in terms of economic efficiency, that it might the expenditure might result in the investment might result in returns, so the return on the capital and even making a profit, although government schemes that make profits are quite rare. But those two things of equity and efficiency are always at the forefront of any rationale, any justification for policy. That's not to say that things like unemployment have been forgotten about, but I think since the Great Moderation, since inflation targeting, since this emphasis on keeping a fairly conservative macroeconomic environment to avoid any kind of shocks, we started off the talk on stabilization, talking about the importance of this, of having a stable macroeconomic environment where everyone feels comfortable, the risk is manageable, the things like investment can be judged within fairly safe parameters, because the government seems to be responsible, is not going to do anything rash, is trying to be responsible with taxpayers' money. All that's fine, but of course the traditional kind of Keynesian concern with unemployment is something which all governments do have to be still concerned about. And it's not the case that you put all your eggs in one basket, concentrate purely on inflation and damn the consequences, because by controlling inflation, of course, we are sometimes curbing the amount of money government can spend in the economy. So you could see where we're not adopting this Keynesian attitude of trying to fuel aggregate demand by spending large sums of money and thinking merely in the short term. Inflation targeting and everything it implies carries a kind of different approach, if you like, towards public finances. That any expenditure by government has to be carefully judged as appropriate to the situation, and this is kind of based, I think, on the fact that this idea of the old Keynesian idea of the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier effect were perhaps a little bit too simplistic, or at least they're too simplistic for the modern world. And of course, they always carried the threat of higher inflation and large government. So we have kind of trying to redress the balance somewhat to try and curb the role of government, allow business to be more productive, be more efficient. But that can mean, of course, that the expenditure that the government perhaps would have spent under a Keynesian type approach is no longer permissible. So it doesn't mean that the government's unconcerned with unemployment, but it does mean that it's no longer the central aspect, perhaps, of public policy, economic policy, fiscal or monetary policy. And I think if we look through the material in the course relating to unemployment, you'll see in any case that, of course, this idea of full employment, which was often phrase which was often used after the Second World War, it was always an aspiration. It was never a reality in any meaningful way. There's always going to be unemployment. It's just a fact of life. And economists have kind of identified different kinds of unemployment. So you have frictional, which is, of course, unemployment caused by things like change of jobs or entering the workforce for the first time, and the time it takes to adjust to get a new job. As I say, changing jobs, any number of temporary circumstances. Then you have structural, which is caused by mismatch of skills or location, or trying to match the jobs to the people who are skilled enough, qualified to perform them. This often happens as a result of technological change or the obsolescence of particular industries. We saw this quite a lot in Britain when many of the coal mines and the steel mills closed down. that many of the people who'd worked in those industries were no longer weren't qualified to do the jobs which were becoming available through technological change, which were no longer in coal mines and steel mills. So retraining is obviously crucial in terms of dealing with structural unemployment, lifelong learning, trying to obtain as many skills as possible. Now, this process is somewhat minimized a little bit, I guess, by things like de-skilling. So the growth of technology has meant that the skill base in many jobs has been reduced, and I guess that means that in some senses the structural unemployment caused by not having the skilled personnel is somewhat reduced, given that many jobs are becoming de-skilled. But still, it remains an important facet in the level of unemployment. There's always an element of mismatch of skills in locations, different parts of the country. And we may see this when Canada suffers manufacturing job losses, as it currently is, of course, with Oshawa and the like. We may see this, that many people, in order to qualify for new jobs, are going to have to retrain, learn new skills. Cyclical unemployment, on the other hand, that's caused by differences in aggregate demand in the economy. Again, this was something that has been identified for quite some time, of course, that there are cycles in the economy, there's fluctuations, there's ups and downs in terms of the amount of demand. That dictates the amount of output, of course, so it means the number of jobs goes up and down. So there's a cyclical element to unemployment, which again, government can do something about. Keynes obviously had the remedy ready to hand, which was to prime the pump, spend money, enact public works. Governments are a bit less reluctant to do that these days. Structural unemployment is probably the one that requires the most thought, I think, because we need to figure out how we calibrate our workforce to the necessary jobs, and that's very hard to do, especially when there's a fast changing world and where the technological demands of the workplace are changing so rapidly. It's very hard to second guess these things. So there's always going to be an element, I guess, of structural unemployment. Trying to minimise that is probably the key thing for government, key task for government in terms of fiscal policy. Maybe having training programs, ongoing training for different age groups, ensuring that technology is harnessed by government, and it might mean trying to attract companies to different parts of the country, of course, to kind of maybe absorb problem areas. This was a favoured policy of the European Union many years ago, trying to give tax breaks and relaxing regulations for many companies to begin in what were seen to be areas which required regional development, largely because they'd lost so many manufacturing jobs. So that's one way government can act to alleviate this problem, of course. Now, we also have something called the natural level of unemployment, and it sounds a bit odd to say there's a natural level, but it's usually seen as being a combination of frictional and structural unemployment, and I think that's a fair kind of summary of it. That there will always be an element of both. Frictional, there's very little the government can actually do about that. That's down to personal choices in many cases, but certainly with structural, there's something government can do about that. I think when we consider cyclical unemployment, well, that can actually affect the level of structural and frictional unemployment as well, because it can kind of prolong the time that it takes to find a job. So say you're just switching between jobs, you might pick the wrong time to do that. There might be a downturn in the economy and sort of high level of unemployment caused by structural and cyclical phenomenon. That's obviously going to impact on frictional unemployment, because it might mean it's going to take longer for you to find another job. So there's intricacies between the different types of unemployment, but it's still a major issue for governments to consider, because of course, aside from the social and psychological aspects of it, anybody who's been unemployed, they'll know it's tough to deal with at times, and there's been a lot of studies on this, and the impact it has on people's psychology, the feeling of worthlessness, and the inertia which it tends to induce in people after a time if they've been unemployed for a long time. But also just the economic inefficiency of it, of course. It's wasting resources, it's wasting human resources which are available. It's loss of tax revenue for the government. It's hemorrhaging the welfare budget as well, because it's increasing the amount of benefits which have to be paid as well. So whether on the basis of equity or the general well-being of society or the economic and financial stability of the state, it's an important thing for government to deal with. Anyway, we'll leave it there for today, and we shall talk more about deficits on Friday. So we'll see you then. Bye for now.